Tucked neatly to the edge of Framlingham in Suffolk lies the curtain walls of its castle. Built originally as a motte and bailey structure in 1148, it was deliberately destroyed following what amounts to be a royal family domestic dispute between King Henry II and his wife and children in 1173 to 1174. On Richard III's accession in 1189, Roger Bigod was made Earl of Norfolk and Constable of Norwich Castle, which was continuing the family tradition, and he inherited his father Hugh Bigod's position as Royal Steward and built Framlingham Castle in Suffolk. Hugh Bigod, incidentally, was one of a group of dissenting barons during the anarchy in the reign of King Stephen, and after coming to power, Henry II attempted to re-establish royal power across the region, and as part of this effort, he confiscated the 4 Bigod castles from Hugh in 1157, but returned the castles of Framlingham and Bungay in 1165 on payment of a large fine of £666. The 2 other properties were given to royal family members. In 1214, Roger sided with the feudal barons who rebelled against King John. Roger and his son Hugh were excommunicated by the Pope for their part in the revolt. In fact, during the year 1213, he actually entertained King John at Framlingham Castle. The First Barons' War began in 1215 between King John and a faction of rebel barons opposed to his rule. Roger Bigod became one of the key opponents to John, having argued over John's requirements for military levies. Royal troops plundered the surrounding lands, and John's army arrived on the 12th of March 1216 and was followed the next day by John himself. He then laid siege to Framlingham Castle, which lasted the whole 2 days, and despite its strong defences, before the defenders decided to surrender. Apparently to encourage the surrender, the king pardoned the earl's followers who submitted, and at the same time confiscated the lands of those who refused to submit. For Roger, it was a no-brainer. With John's permission, messages were sent on the 14th from the castle to Roger, who, being influenced by the fate of Rochester Castle the previous year, agreed that the garrison of 26 knights, 20 sergeants, 7 crossbowmen and a priest could surrender without a fight. And Roger appears to later have regained his castle, with his grandson, another Roger, inheriting Framlingham in 1225. In 1270, Roger Bigod, the 5th Earl, inherited the castle and undertook extensive renovations there, whilst living in considerable luxury and style. This included the Great Park, which was an enclosed 243 hectares, or 600 acres, stretching 3 kilometres or 1.9 miles to the north of the castle, and was characterised by bank and ditch boundaries, which were common elsewhere in England, but very unusual in Suffolk at that time. The park had a lodge built into it, which later had a recreational garden built around it. Although still extremely wealthy, the Bigods were now having to borrow increasing sums from moneylenders, but by the end of the century, Roger was also heavily in debt to Edward I as well. As a result, Roger led the baronial opposition to Edward's request for additional taxes and support for his French wars. Edward responded by seizing Roger's land and only releasing them on condition that Roger granted them to the crown after his death. And Roger agreed, and Framlingham Castle passed to the crown in 1306. By the end of the 13th century, a large prison had been built into the castle. This was probably constructed in the northwest corner of the lower court and overlooked by the prison tower. The prisoners kept there in the medieval period included local poachers, and in the 15th century, religious dissidents, including Lollard supporters. In the 14th century, Framlingham Castle passed to the Brotherton family, and for 17 years it was the home of Margaret Brotherton, the first woman to be made a duchess in her own right. Following Margaret's death in 1483, the castle passed into the hands of the Howard family through John Howard, a grandson of Thomas de Mowbray. John was eventually killed at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, during which he was fighting on the side of the House of York. Although John held Framlingham Castle for only 2 years, he and John's son, Thomas Howard, is also thought to have made some significant refurbishments to the castle, which included remodelling of the gatehouse, placing of their family crest above the gatehouse entrance, and the addition of brick chimneys. The drawbridge outside the gatehouse was replaced with the current permanent bridge between 1524 and 1547, and by this time a half-moon defensive structure had been built in stone to defend it. A pleasure garden had been built in the lower court by the 16th century with several ornamental ponds and terraced walkways. The garden would probably had fruit trees, herb gardens and fountains. Another pleasure garden was built into the bailey, and a second bridge was built across the moat to allow access directly to it from the inner court. The prison tower was redesigned to become a viewable gallery for the new formal gardens below. The Howard family's ownership of Framlingham Castle ended in 1547, and following the execution of Henry Howard by Henry VIII in the same year. Consequently, the castle was once more in royal hands. Edward VI, Henry's successor, is said to have held his first court at Framlingham Castle, and in 1552 he gave the castle to his half-sister Mary I, along with the Howard estates in East Anglia. In the following year, Edward was dead, and a brief struggle for the throne ensued. On the one hand was Mary, the king's half-sister, and on the other was Lady Jane Grey, Edward's first cousin, once removed. A plot was hatched to ensure that Jane, a Protestant, would be England's new ruler. Mary, however, withdrew from London to Framlingham Castle when she heard of the plot. Along the way, Mary gathered her supporters, and by the time she reached the castle, she had about 15,000 men willing to fight for her. She was there proclaimed Queen after the plot failed, and its leader, the Duke of Northumberland, surrendered. Thus bloodshed was avoided, and Mary returned to London in triumph. Framlingham Castle was left in the hands of the Howard family for the last time in 1635, when it was sold to Sir Robert Hitcham, a politician who rose to the rank of Attorney General, for the princely sum of £14,000. Hitcham died the following year, and the castle and its estates were left to Pembroke College, Cambridge, his alma mater. The college inherited the castle on the condition that the property was put into a trust which would benefit Framlingham, Debenham and Coggeshall. Additionally, Hitcham stated in his will that apart from the castle walls, the rest of the structure was to be demolished and a poorhouse to be built on the site. The poorhouse continued operating from the castle until about 1832. Later, it was used as a drill hall, a county court, and as well as containing the local parish jail and stocks. During World War II, it was used by the British military as part of the regional defences against a potential German invasion. And of course today the property is now owned and maintained by English Heritage and is visited by thousands each year. But there does the story end. Let's have a look at some of the anecdotes and legends attached to this wonderful site. Because of Framlingham's long history, there are many sad events from people's lives buried in the walls of the castle. Mostly during the day, the site remains a busy hub for visitors, but at night and occasionally during odd periods of the daytime, there are those that lived and died that are released from their earthly bonds to haunt the castle's domain. In fact, visitors on their Facebook page will discover that people have left their own accounts of hauntings at the site, and that also includes a senior member of staff.
My grandmother was the custodian of the castle in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and my side of the family lived in the house in the grounds to assist her. What is now called the Red House was known to me as the Captain's House, as this was the original house for the captain of the poorhouse that was built on site after the inside of the castle was demolished. My brother remembered the apparition that would often be seen in the bedrooms of the house, and no dog would enter what was then the tea room. My grandmother told me that on occasions she had seen soldiers walking the wall walk at night, and my father had seen just a pair of legs coming up the path that leads from the flat bit up to the main bridge. Others have seen a ghostly figure falling from the top of the prison tower into the dungeon below. For a very young me, I would often hear what can only be described as a noisy crowd in the poorhouse, now often called the Great Hall, and the workman would send me to tell the visitors that the castle was closed, but no one was ever there.
One account that makes interesting reading is from Andrew Wells, who is the historic property steward at Framlingham Castle, and he told the Eastern Daily Press of his unsettling experiences.
There were 3 of us in the admissions building, and all of us were on one side of the room. All of a sudden, we heard the storeroom door handle move as if someone was trying to open the door. We looked to see the door open, but none of us were anywhere near it, and there was not any wind blowing. It was the end of the day, and I was in the shop on my own when I had a feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore it. Then in the corner of my eye I noticed what looked like a boot walk itself out of the bakehouse door, then round behind me until it went into the fireplace and disappeared. I was in the attic looking for something when I heard a noise sounding like a small stone being kicked across the floor. The longer I stayed up there, the more frequent the noise became. It was at that point I decided something or someone did not want me up there and left. Another time, when I was going into the attic, as I was going up the stairs and turning to go round the corner, I noticed in the corner of my eye a dark figure standing over me. As I got into the attic, I turned to see nothing there. On one evening, I was up on the wall walk, walking over the gate towards the house. All of a sudden, I felt like someone was following me. When I turned round expecting to see a colleague behind me, I saw a dark figure with a white face walking towards me about 10 metres away. I double-took, and the figure had disappeared. I then turned back and headed down to ask a colleague if it was them, but they had not got that far round.
And lastly, there is a connection between Framlingham Castle and Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witch-finder general, who, during the 17th century, is believed to have murdered over 900 people accused of witchcraft. Hopkins was born in Great Wenham, Suffolk, some 30 miles south of Framlingham. He was the 4th son and one of 6 children. His father, James Hopkins, was a Puritan clergyman and vicar of St John's of Great Wenham in Suffolk. The family were at one point landowners to lands and tenements in Framlingham at the castle. These long-lost properties were likely acquired after the Howard family had lost ownership and were forced to sell. Accordingly, they provided the inheritance used by Hopkins to purchase the Thorn Inn at Mistley in Essex for 100 marks. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show, and if not already a subscriber, if you could click the subscribe button, and don't forget to click the bell icon for any updates of any news or new releases. Thank you.